going to start by talking about Latin America in the post war period, and then we're going to switch over and talk a little bit about Sub Saharan Africa. Latin America was basically untouched by World War I, but was still struck by the disruptions of the period. After a decade of violence that saw revolutionaries turn into political leaders only to be assassinated in Mexico, Plutarco Elias Calles was elected president and served 4 years, 1924 to 1928. He founded the National Revolutionary Party, which governed the country for the next 71 years, from 1929 to 2000. And you guys are too young to remember this, but it was a big deal in the year 2000 when Vicente Fox won election to the presidency. I mean, it's a big deal if I can still remember who was elected president of Mexico in the year 2000. Unless I looked it up, I couldn't tell you who's president of Mexico. Lázaro Cárdenas became president of Mexico in 1934 and removed generals from government positions and instead brought peasants and workers' organizations into the party. Cárdenas also embarked on an ambitious land redistribution scheme, giving 44 million acres to peasant communes and nationalized the railroads. In 1938, Cárdenas seized the foreign oil industry. When Cárdenas' term ended in 1940, Mexico was still a land of poor farmers and a small industrial base, but the political system was free of chaos and dictatorships for the time being, and the Catholic Church was no longer in control of education, the wealthy few no longer monopolized the land, and the nationalization of oil demonstrated Mexico's independence. In Argentina, agricultural exports such as merino wool and longhorn Creole cattle boosted the Argentinian economy. Argentina's government represented the interests of the oligarchia, a very small group of wealthy landowners. They were the ones who owned houses in Buenos Aires built to resemble Paris. Focused on producing wheat and meat, they were content to let British companies build railroads, processing plants, and public utilities. Argentina imported almost all manufactured goods from Europe and the United States. Brazil produced the most coffee in the world on vast estates and had natural supplies of rubber trees in the forests. As in Argentina, the wealthy built lavish buildings in Rio de Janeiro. As in Argentina, the British companies built railroads, harbors, and other infrastructure. Both Argentina and Brazil had small but outspoken middle classes that demanded a share in government and looked to European models. The poor were mainly Spanish and Italian immigrants turned landless laborers and meat processors in Argentina and sharecroppers and plantation workers in Brazil, many of whom descended from slaves, and again, slavery only outlawed in Brazil in the 1880s. Rubber exports collapsed after 1912, replaced by cheaper plantation rubber from Southeast Asia. The outbreak of war put an end to imports from Europe and Britain as France focused all their industries on war production, and Germany was cut off entirely by the blockade. These disruptions weakened the landowning class. In Argentina, the urban middle class obtained the secret ballot and universal male suffrage. Desperate for money to pay for the war, Great Britain sold off many of its railroad, streetcar, and other companies to the governments of Argentina and Brazil. After the war, South America prospered. Trade with Europe resumed, export prices remained high. Nevertheless, workers and middle-class professionals demanded social reforms and a larger voice in politics. In Argentina, student and worker demonstrations were brutally crushed. In Brazil, junior officers rebelled several times, calling for universal suffrage, social reforms, and freedom for labor unions. These demonstrations did not accomplish any immediate gains, but set the stage for later reform movements. After 1930, the Great Depression hurt Argentina badly. A military revolt unseated the popularly elected president, but another military revolt in 1943 brought Juan Perón and his wife Eva Perón. The Perón's intentions were clear. Quote, "Civilians will never understand the greatness of our ideal. We shall therefore have to eliminate them from the government, and give them the only mission which corresponds to them, work and obedience." End quote. Once in power, the officers took over the highest positions in government and business and began to lavish money on military equipment as well as their own salaries. Their goal, inspired by the Nazis, was to conquer South America. Eva Perón was the symbol of his regime. With her help, Juan Perón won the presidency in 1946. After her death, he was overthrown in another coup. Alright, so that's a lot on kind of South American countries. For the next little part of the lecture, we're going to switch and talk about Sub-Saharan Africa. When nationalist movements threatened European rule in Asia in the early 20th century, Africa was still being subjected to the economic and political forces of imperialism. By the end of the First World War, Europeans had been ruling Africa for quite a while. And affected by a long history of racism, Europeans maintained that people who were accustomed to bare subsistence would work fewer hours if their pay was raised, rather than strive to better their standard of living, the way that Europeans theoretically would. This theory stigmatized African labor and justified paying subsistence wages, if you could even call them that. Outside of Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa, few Europeans lived in the continent of Africa. In 1930, Nigeria, with a population of 20 million people, was ruled by 386 British officials and some 8,000 cops and military personnel. Even a small presence stimulated deep social and economic changes. Few Africans benefited from the changes that colonial powers brought when they installed railroads, mines, plantations, and telegraphs. Colonial governments took land from Africans and sold or leased them to European or American companies. Some farmers did see benefits. In the Gold Coast, small farmers profited from the price of cacao, as did palm oil producers in Nigeria and coffee growers in East Africa. In most of Africa, women played a major role in the retail trades, selling cloth, food, pots, pans, and other items in the markets. Women maintained economic independence and kept their household finances separate from those of their husbands, a tradition that predated the colonial era. For many Africans, however, economic development meant working in European-owned mines and plantations, often under compulsion. Colonial governments were eager to develop the resources of their territories, but would not pay wages high enough to attract workers. Instead, they used their police powers to force Africans to work under harsh conditions for little or no pay. In the 1920s, when the government of French Equatorial Africa decided to build a railroad over 300 miles long, they drafted 127,000 men to carve out the roadbed across mountains and through the rainforest. Lacking proper food, clothing, and medical care, 20,000 of them died, an average of 64 deaths per mile of track. Europeans prided themselves on bringing modern healthcare to Africa, but before the 1930s there was too little of it to help the majority of Africans, and other aspects of colonialism worsened health. Migrants and soldiers spread tuberculosis, syphilis, gonorrhea, and malaria. Sleeping sickness and smallpox epidemics raged in Central Africa. In recruiting men to work, colonial governments also depleted rural areas of farmers needed to plant and harvest crops. Forced requisition of food to feed the workers left the rest of the population undernourished and vulnerable to disease. Not until the 1930s did the colonial governments realize the negative consequences of their labor policies and begin to invest in agricultural development and healthcare for Africans. The realities of racial discrimination under colonial rule contributed to the rise of nationalism among educated Africans. In 1912, Western-educated lawyers and journalists founded the African National Congress to defend the interests of Africans. These nationalist movements were partly inspired by the Pan-Africanists from America, such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Jamaican Marcus Garvey, who advocated for the unity of African peoples around the world. Before World War II, however, they were small and had little influence. The new media of cinema and radio had little impact on Africa. The first attempts at radio broadcasting occurred in South Africa in 1924, and down to World War II, the South African Broadcasting Corporation established a monopoly over the medium and broadcast only in English and Afrikaans. The Afrikaans were the Dutch people in South Africa, if you recall that. Efforts in other colonies likewise targeted Europeans, with the exception of British West Africa. Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Nigeria, where African languages were utilized. After 1936, the British authorities began to see radio as the medium for reaching Africans who did not speak English. Prior to World War II, Africa had almost no cinematic presence, apart from the Tarzan films made in Hollywood between 1918 and 1949. A few films were made for British and Afrikaner audiences in South Africa, but the French issued a decree in their colonies in 1934 prohibiting the shooting of movies. During World War II, increased forced labor, inflation, and requisitions of raw materials had a profound effect on Africans who were far removed from the theaters of war. Yet the war also brought hope. During the campaign to oust the Italians from Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie led his own troops into Addis Ababa, his capital, and reclaimed his title. 1 million Africans served as soldiers and carriers in Burma, North Africa, and Europe. They listened to Allied propaganda in favor of European liberation movements and against Nazi racism, and returned to their countries with new and radical ideas. And in the post-war period, as we'll talk about in a couple of lectures, we're going to start to see the rise of decolonization movements. But that's another story for another day.